We are very fortunate today to have three veterans who are with us, and the Buddhist monk and teacher Thich Nhat Hanh likes to say that veterans are like the light at the tip of a candle who tell us about the realities of war and illuminate the way to peace. With that notion, our three veterans, Mike Dedrick, Sarah Blum, and Aaron Myracle, are going to open up with about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minute presentations, and then we're going to go to questions. So first, and I'll introduce them very briefly at the outset, and please just introduce yourselves further as you will. So first up is Mike Dedrick. Mike is a Vietnam War veteran and a retired construction contractor in Seattle. He is a longtime anti-war campaigner and a dedicated speaker of truth to power. I've had the pleasure of working alongside Mike on a number of occasions at different events. He is a member, main organizations I believe are Vietnam Veterans Against the War and a long-time work with the organization Veterans for Peace. Like Amy, Mike has been particularly interested in the issue of military recruitment, and I know of some work that he does that he calls counter recruitment, and many other things over the years. So, Mike?
Okay, well, thanks, Evan, for that. Probably a better introduction than I deserve, but I am Mike Dedrick, and I'm currently a member of Veterans for Peace, Greater Seattle Veterans for Peace, Chapter 92. I was originally, when I got back from Vietnam, a member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I served in 1971 as its regional coordinator. And we can probably get into a few other miscellaneous things about myself, but I've got sort of just like a prepared shtick here so that we can ask questions about it afterwards. So I'll just go ahead and read this sort of narrative. In March 1966, I lost my student deferment after flunking out twice from the University of Washington and was drafted. After basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana, I was sent to Fort Holabird, Maryland, for training as an intelligence analyst and interrogator. This was followed by several months of Vietnamese language at Fort Bliss, El Paso, Texas. I arrived in Vietnam in November 1967 and was assigned to Company A 519th Military Intelligence Battalion and worked out of the Combined Military Interrogation Center, CMIC, on Plantation Road near the Phu Tu Hoa racetrack in Cho Lon, which at that time was a suburb of Saigon. Those first few months were mostly uneventful, getting used to the routine of interrogations, guard duty, and after-duty drinking at our little rooftop club and at the bars along Plantation Road. Everything changed at Tet, the New Year's holiday at the end of January, when the war came to us and literally blew up in our faces. Tet marked the infiltrations of thousands of NLF, you might know that as VC, troops into cities throughout Vietnam, and for our company, it meant being hunkered down in our concrete barracks, keeping our heads down and trying to stay out of the fighting, which raged from the gates of Tan Son Nhut Airport, down Plantation Road, through Cho Lon, and onto the Y Bridge and beyond. In lulls of the fighting, we drove on armed convoys to our duty stations. The fighting in our area, which was most intense in the first weeks of Tet, after Tet, persisted through May, when the NLF launched another offensive. U.S. and ARVN forces in response used rockets, napalm, and bombs to fight the infiltrators, with the result that large parts of Cho Lon were destroyed and many civilians were killed. That destruction came very close to Company A on the 7th of May, when the infiltrators in the village immediately next to our barracks were attacked by Allied aircraft. The village, which had many refugees, was almost destroyed. Some of us had a bird's eye view of the destruction from the tops of our barracks until the shrapnel from the bombs became too dangerous and we had to evacuate our roof. Our village neighbors were not spared. We estimated that perhaps 200 people had died in the attack, and we had an immediate, intimate encounter with what war is about when a dozen villagers came to our barracks, some of them, including children, dying miserable and bloody deaths on our courtyard. Our medic had no morphine, so we had no option but to listen and watch them die. The rest of the tour seemed almost anticlimactic. I volunteered often for field duty, not for any heroic reasons, but to get away from the chicken shit irritation of barracks life and mind-numbing guard duty. While this meant occasional mortar, rocket, and sporadic small arms fire, it seemed minor compared to the bomb debris of Cholon and driving around dead bodies in the street. As an interrogator, I talked to dozens of prisoners. While I was fortunate to not be personally involved in torturing anybody, I was aware that some Americans did. I once threatened a fellow NCO who had a reputation for abusing prisoners that I would shoot him if he molested any POWs in my control. Most U.S.-trained interrogators at CMIC knew and generally abided by the Geneva Conventions. The same could not be said of the ARVN or of some U.S. field units. Many of the prisoners I talked to were wounded or had been wounded, and my duties often took me to field POW camps and hospitals. I was weary of redundant and pointless interrogations, the grinding reality of dead and wounded Vietnamese, and was looking forward to leaving Vietnam and the Army. My initial enthusiasm for returning home did not last. I returned in November of 1968 and watched the war grind on for another 5 more years. Every new paper read or TV news seen was a reminder of what I knew the war was. Although I went back to school and finished my BA and worked to augment the paltry money of the GI Bill, my major form of recreation was drinking. I did not connect my time in Vietnam with my mental state until 1972, when I had a sudden memory of the May attacks and the dead civilians. This sudden memory was accompanied with slideshow effects, visual memories of Vietnam that were always more or less present, though moved to the back of my mind with the daily preoccupations of work and school. The war had always left me angry with the lies my government had used to start and continue the war. That anger led me to get involved with Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which proved to be as necessary and therapeutic to my then undiagnosed PTSD as alcohol. It was not until 1991, about then, that I attempted to get any formal recognition of my PTSD. I'd stayed away from the VA because of my distrust of anything to do with the military, but was persuaded by an old classmate and Vietnam veteran to apply for some compensation from the VA. This I did and was awarded a service-connected disability for malaria and PTSD. By this time I was also married and had quit drinking, which both improved my mental health. Although the first Gulf also had bangered me and caused some re-experiences of Vietnam, it was not until the second Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq that I had some more serious problems. In particular, it was the fighting in Fallujah and the destruction of that city that brought me back to my time in Vietnam and the destruction in Cholon. My depression and anger manifested itself in road rage and near continuous reminders of my Vietnam tour. I went to the VA at the urging of my wife and was given a one-on-one therapy writing program with a psychologist. I asked at the start of the therapy if this writing and talking therapy would make things more difficult. He said it would help. I also attended a mindfulness course which introduced me and the others in the group to mediation and being aware of yourself. And Evan mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh. It was kind of an odd sort of situation to be sitting in this mindfulness therapy group with, there were a few Iraq and Afghanistan vets, mostly Vietnam vets. We were using coursework and handouts provided by Thich Nhat Hanh. So you had Vietnam veterans at the VA military hospital using coursework by a pacifist Vietnamese monk. Mm-hmm. Nobody thought that there was anything out of sorts with that at all. This therapy helped me to stop from having intrusive visual re-experience of the war, and the meditation was useful in particular in getting to sleep and calming generally. It was at this time that I learned PTSD was not a linear condition, that it changes over time and often does, that it is a chronic condition, but one that can be mitigated. Some things remain very sensitive, though. Usually I find someplace quiet for the 4th of July and New Year's fireworks. I sometimes find myself sidetracked as I did 2 years ago when I was screaming and swearing at a neighbor who was admiring some fireworks at the end of my block. At this point, I feel that I have some luck at being able to direct frustration and anger constructively with anti-work with Veterans for Peace and other activism. I have also had the benefit of some professional help. The long-term stability of marriage and a loving wife is a major factor. So, thank you.
So, Mike's comments remind me to say that these are very special individuals. We asked these 3 people particularly because we were looking for people who could talk to you not only about their war experiences, but their personal experiences, and people that have been impacted personally by war who can be able to get in front of an audience and reveal themselves and actually talk about it are very important and very unusual. So thank you all for being here. Next up is Sarah Blum, who is also a Vietnam War veteran. She's a nurse psychotherapist with almost 30 years of clinical experience. She served as an operating room nurse at the 12th Evacuation Hospital, Cu Chi, Vietnam, during the height of the fighting in 1967. Back in the U.S., she served as head nurse of the orthopedic ward at Madigan Army Hospital in 1968. She is the author of Women Under Fire, Abuse in the Military, which was published in 2013, and there's a link to the website for her book on the course page. Sarah?
Thanks. There's also a lot of resources there on the website if you're interested in going there, and more information about me if you're interested in that. It's good to be here. Good to see all of you. I was here in 1974, 1976, this very building, in a master's program in psychosocial nursing, which is how I was able to later become a nurse psychotherapist. Yeah, Evan pretty much covered the introduction for me. I'm also a peace activist, and as a side note, I am an African drummer, and I play African balafon. And perhaps later you might ask me how those things can be healing for veterans. I also like to row, and I have my own rowing shell, and I'm looking at getting on a rowing team down in Olympia, an old folks rowing team. So yeah, I was at the 12th Evacuation Hospital, Cu Chi, Vietnam, 1967, January 67 to January 68. And the 12th Evac was right beside a place called the Hobo Woods, and on the edge of the Iron Triangle. And it was where all of the operations, all the military operations were happening in 1967. So I saw the absolute worst of war. We had a constant flow of casualties, and thanks to the helicopter, they were on the operating room table within 3 to 5 minutes of being wounded. So if you look back to previous wars, Korea did have some helicopters, but really in Vietnam is where they really did the work of bringing the guys in, and really quickly, so we could have them on the operating room table and we could save a lot of them, which we did. So the wounds came from mortars, from artillery, usually American artillery, grenades, RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, AK-47s, booby traps, and landmines. And my very first operating room case, when I got there, the surgeon walked in and he looked at the casualty, and there were wounds everywhere because he tripped the landmines. He had wounds all over his body, front and back. And he looked at me and he said, "Which side do you want?" And I said, "Sir?" He said, "Which side do you want?" And that's when I found out that I was going to be doing the very same thing that the surgeon was going to do, and did that for an entire year. And if you want details about that, you can ask me that later. So my hospital was the largest user of fresh blood in all of Vietnam because of that, and I saw the horrific results of war, what war does to people, to human bodies, and I saw it consistently for that year. And I saw how they, you know, my brother soldiers lost their limbs, their eyes, and sometimes multiple limbs. And so later, if you want to ask me about that, I can tell you that I had this question going for years and years and years. Did they want to live the way we left them? So I knew within 2 weeks of being there that the war was totally wrong. And then, of course, there wasn't anything I could do about it. But also, I was really committed to serving my brother's soldiers in whatever way I could, and that's why I signed up to go. So, so I was there, and basically was there for the full year, and oftentimes standing, literally standing in my brother's blood for hours on end. And then I was there when we, as a team, the surgeons and myself, had to make these decisions, these horrific decisions about life and death. Like, is this guy going to want to live this way, depending on what we're able to do for them? Because they're healthy, strong young men, and so they can live through even having most of their total body gone. And so you could think about that, what it would be like to be in that situation and have to make those decisions. Well, we can't, oops, sorry, I'm supposed to do that. We can't, it's just a very difficult situation. It's a very moral dilemma, and it's something that I hope that you'll think about, because we can't kill them and they're healthy and strong, but what's left of them is the problem. So then I did get back here to the United States in 1968. I was very fortunate that I was with an orthopedic surgeon in Vietnam, knew him really well because we worked together over there. And so I was fortunate that he asked for me to be his head nurse. This is down at Madigan General Hospital in Tacoma, which is how I got out here. I'm originally from New Jersey. So I became the head nurse of the orthopedic ward thanks to him, and it was really the best thing that could have happened to me and the best duty, because I actually got to greet the guys coming off the buses and welcome them home. And if you know about the Vietnam generation, you know that we didn't get a welcome home. And I got to work with them personally. And so something that I noticed was that their physical wounds were not healing the way wounds do heal. There are also a lot of them that were impotent for no specific reason. There was no organic, no physical reason for them to be impotent, but they were. And it had to do with all that was going on with our generation, with the war, and with the public. So I knew they were all messed up in their heads and hearts. And I thought I could perhaps get some help for them. I talked to the doctors, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the social worker. There was absolutely no help for them. Remember, we didn't know what PTSD was then. The military has a horrible memory. Every time there is a war, there is this problem that follows it. And it's been given different names. Combat stress, battle fatigue, shell shock, all the same thing. It's all what we now know as PTSD. But each time we have a war, they forget that. And they forget how to help those that went to war and then come back with that. So I talked to my orthopedic surgeon about the problem, and that I'd talked to all those folks to ask for help, and there is no help for them. What can we do? He said, I'm going to use my clinic office, which was 100 yards down the ramp. You use my office on the ward, and you do it. You work with them. So what I did was I trained one of my guys who had an injury that allowed him to be very active on the ward and do things. I trained him to answer my phones, do a lot of administrative work. And so then I was able to go into the doctor's office and work with the guys. And they were getting better because I was listening to them, I cared about them, I was connected to them, and I could help give them some ideas. And I was doing all of this intuitively because I hadn't been here yet, right? I hadn't really learned the official way to do that. But it was working, they were getting better. In fact, as a head nurse, I could give them weekend passes. And I knew when I came in on Monday morning, if I had given somebody a weekend pass that I was working with, I knew on Monday morning when I came in without a word spoken, I knew if they had resolved their problem. So then 1981 for me was the trigger that opened up my own PTSD, and that was when the Iranian hostages came back. And you can look in your history to see about when what happened there, but we had these guys that were taken by the Iranians. They were hostages for a while, and then they were coming back. This was the actual day they were coming back, and they were getting off the plane, and it was on the radio, and there was this big celebration. And I was in my car going to work as a psychotherapist, and I started yelling and screaming, what did they do? They didn't do anything. What about us? We never got a welcome home, and you know, the whole thing anyway. It was like somebody took a zipper and opened me up, and all this stuff was coming out. So I had a full-blown case of PTSD. And then I went into therapy to deal with all of that, to get well. And I was so impressed with the therapy that I had and what I was able to accomplish and how much better I felt that I decided that that was the path I was going to take. Even though I'd already sort of been on the path, that was a conscious decision then to become a healer, a nurse psychotherapist, and help heal the wounds of war, but also to help heal trauma in anyone that has trauma. And that's what I've been doing for over 30 years. So I want to fast forward now to 1996, and right here on Bainbridge Island we had the Earth Stewards Network, and the day that Vietnam opened to tourists, to Americans to come visit, Earth Stewards Network created this program called Peace Trees Vietnam. And I was on the very first program, the very first Peace Trees Vietnam trip. It was an opportunity to go back to Vietnam to help heal the land and help heal me. So first they took the landmines out of the land. There were still live landmines there. And then we worked with a group of Vietnamese, and we planted 2,000 indigenous Vietnamese trees right there in that land and created Friendship Forest Park. Before I went to Vietnam, before the trip actually took place, one of the leaders, whose name was Danon Perry, he looked him in the eye and he said, Sarah, somebody needs to write the woman's story in Vietnam, and that's you. And it had a big impact, but it didn't get me right. It didn't get me started. It just didn't. So then 2002, 2003, I'm sure you were with me there, we protested and marched against the war in Iraq. And I was everywhere. I was in the federal building, I was downtown, I was on the streets, wherever I could be, and I was wearing my field jacket and protesting against the war in Iraq, because I knew that it was not okay. It was never okay for us to go there. So 2006, I met a college professor who was very tuned in, very intuitive, and she said to me, Sarah, you're supposed to be writing about women in the military and you're not doing it. And I said, okay. And I knew she was right. I knew she was right, but I just hadn't started yet. So I did start. That's what I needed. I got a kick in the butt and I started. So from 2006 all the way up until when this book was published, I interviewed 60 women vets from World War II. The oldest was 85, Spitfire woman, all the way up to Iraq and Afghanistan. And a lot of the stories are in there and more coming. And so 2006 to 2009, I think I'd done maybe about 20, 25 by that time. And I'd written quite a bit. And so I decided to turn what I had written over to a guy that calls himself a book doctor, he's an editor. I met him at the Pacific Northwest Writers Association conference. And I asked him for feedback because I wanted to make sure I was on the right track. After all, I'd never written before other than school papers. So he gave me a tremendous amount of feedback, very detailed, very specific, but there was one thing in his feedback that stood out like a neon sign. And he said, look at these stories you have about abuse toward women. And I had some, there were some in there. He said, that's what you need to focus on. You need to research and focus on the culture of abuse toward women in the military. Well, I did not know there was a culture of abuse toward women in the military. I did not experience that. And so I got the message, and I did start to research, and I spent like all the next years until I did this, reading everything that you could read about that subject and interviewing as many women as I could, and then asking more specific questions about that. Now I'm going to just share a couple of short stories that are actually from the women that I interviewed from the book. So the first one is Colleen Mussolino, who is now passed. She was an Army cook, and she was gang raped by 4 soldiers, American soldiers, who took her literally kicking and screaming. She was a very feisty woman. Kicking, screaming, biting, whatever she could do. 4 of them, they took her into the woods to rape her. And she was fighting so hard that they had to literally put their knees on her arms and leg to hold her down so that they could gang rape her, and they did. When they were all done, and they beat her unconscious, and when they were all done, she was bruised on her head, her neck, her arms, her torso, and she was bleeding down her thighs. When she regained consciousness and figured out where she was and what had happened to her, she was able to get herself to the road where the MPs, military police, picked her up and took her to the hospital. She was treated very well at the hospital, and then criminal investigation, CID, took over. They interrogated her from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m., 5 days a week, for 6 weeks. And then they threatened her with dishonorable discharge if she did not sign their paper saying she would not prosecute. It's a story that's very illustrative of the situation, so that's why I tell that one. The next one is Ellen Haynes. She was a really exemplary, decorated combat medic in Iraq, 2005 to 2006. So she was taking a break one day. She was outside the emergency room, sitting down on a bench, taking a break. This guy came up to her. He was a physical therapist assistant, and he was talking to her about religion and the Bible. He was having a hard time. He told her that. She was very positive and supportive and trying to encourage him. And then he said, "Can I have a hug?" And so she gave him a hug. And what he did when she hugged him was he twisted her arm behind her back, really twisted it hard, forced her down to the clinic where he worked so that he could rape her. And he said to her, "Don't scream. You can't do anything to me because I outrank you. You will lose your family, your job, everything, because you are married and I am not, and it will be consensual." And I have to tell you that he was right. And I hope that that galls you that he was right. But he was. So then she didn't do anything about it. She didn't report it. Every woman in the military knows that the last thing you want to do is report a sexual assault, because that's when everything unfolds, everything comes down on you. It's horrible. So she didn't do anything. She continued with her work. About 2 weeks later, one of her doctors said, "You need to take these papers to the physical therapy clinic." She didn't want to go, but she was ordered to. She has to do it. So she went down there. She took the papers. She was hoping she could just go like that and leave. But he grabbed her, pulled her in, locked the door behind her, raped her again. And then he did it 10 more times to her. So here's what she said. "I still did not want to jeopardize my career, but I did not want him to keep raping me. I did not know what to do. I agonized for days." So then she told the rapist that she was going to report him. And he said, "I will tell them you are an adulteress having an affair with me and that you came on to me, and you will go to jail." So she did report it, and she was sent home. And then she was kicked out of the military without any benefits because they gave her this label of personality disorder. And that's what the military tends to do in modern day, is if a woman reports sexual assault, if she has the audacity to report it, then she's going to pay for it, and there's all forms of retaliation, but one of them is that the military stamps them with this label, personality disorder, so that they have no benefits and they have no care at the VA.
Thank you, Sarah. Next up is Aaron Myracle. Aaron is a former U.S. Army military police sergeant. He's a disabled veteran of the war in Iraq. He deployed to Baghdad in 2007 as part of the troop surge and was based at Victory Base Complex, which was home to one of the largest U.S.-run open-air burn pits. He is currently a student of social work at UW-Tacoma, with an emphasis on radical social work and community organizing. He's a member of Iraq Veterans Against the War, and he has worked with Coffee Strong.
Yeah, so I'm Aaron. Is anybody else graduating in June? Am I the only person? Woo! How awesome is that? Yeah, I'm super excited to be graduating, although I just turn right back around and go to grad school. So, yeah, you kind of summed up all the boring introductory stuff. If you want to know how the war has impacted my life, sitting here with a door behind me is really, really difficult. I have been hyper aware of this door since I walked in the room. The only reason it's really bearable is because it would kind of be awkward to sit under the TV, because then I'd have something hanging over my head. So there's really no good place to sit in this room, so there's also no bad place, if that makes sense. So that's certainly one way. And actually, my war started before I ever got to the war, when the Army National Guard, the Washington Army National Guard in this state, sent me to New Orleans after the levees came down in 2005 following Hurricane Katrina, and sent me with loaded guns, which was odd and gave me this sense that I was policing people who didn't need to be policed. They needed my help, and made me start questioning what exactly is my actual role as a soldier, as a military police soldier. And while I was trying to digest those things, somebody had the brilliant idea that we would send as many troops as humanly possible to Baghdad in 2007 in an attempt to rid Baghdad of its own people, basically. And so I got to be part of that surge. I can't really go any farther. I assume at some point it's been discussed that over 1 million people were killed in the Iraq War, and 90% of them or more were civilians. So that's something that I carry every day, that I have my individual personal traumas, but larger than that and outside of that, I have the knowledge that I participated in something that killed almost 1 million innocent people. And there's kind of no pithy way to say that. I don't have really flowery words. That's just shit that I have to carry. That is a public health consequence of war, that everybody who is involved will carry that knowledge and be hyper aware of their role in that experience for the rest of their lives. I am very grateful to be here, because part of my healing from that is coming to places like this and telling my story and telling the other halves of those stories as well, and making sure that people hear that. That's part of my healing. I believe very strongly that I have something called moral injury as a result of what I went through, and part of my personal path to healing from that is telling my truth, making amends, making reparations. I'm part of multiple projects that work on making reparations and amends with the people of Iraq for the destruction that was caused in that invasion and occupation. In my personal life, what that means for me is a lot of time hanging out with folks like this, older veterans who are kind of showing younger veterans like me the path through the things that have happened to us. There's certainly differences. I didn't get to drink off duty. There's no alcohol allowed in the theater of operations in Iraq or Afghanistan. Currently deployed troops don't drink, and I'm not sure how good of an idea that is, because I think we come home and we abuse alcohol even more than what your experience was, because we were also dry for a year, at least most of us were. I was an MP, so I didn't drink. I followed the rules.
That was a good thing and a bad thing.
Yeah, everything seems to be a double-edged sword. And I had a lot of experience with the things that you were talking about, but from a different perspective. I was always the MP who was getting flagged down on the side of the road or responding to a call, doing this investigation, talking with victims of really heinous assaults and rapes, and then turning them over to CID, knowing that CID's job was to cover these things up. Responding to suicides on base in Iraq, sitting with the bodies of soldiers who had died by suicide, knowing that Criminal Investigation Division was going to say that it was an accident. And that happened a lot. When I went to submit paperwork for my post-traumatic stress claim to the VA, I had to substantiate instances of having been in situations where people were killed who I witnessed being killed. And in doing research to fill out that paperwork, found that many of the deaths that I knew to have been caused by suicide or by assault between two soldiers had suddenly become natural causes or accidents or enemy action. That was a pretty significant blow. That definitely was something that still I struggle with, I think. And again, coming and telling these stories is kind of part of coping with that knowledge that my government lied about things, that I was there, I know what happened. And I don't think that those people are being done justice through those lies. But that is again, part of the public health cost. When we have to shy away from the truth, someone pays for that lack of truth. The people who witness the truth, the people who are part of that truth, pay a pretty heavy price for being asked to lie for the rest of our lives. I had a security clearance, so I could actually go to prison if I sat and told you, like, no, here were their names and here's what's really happened. And I don't really look that great in orange, so I'm not gonna sit here and tell you their names, but I can tell you that there were a lot more suicides. There's a lot more suicides than 22 or 23 a day. In part because those soldiers who are discharged with personality disorders aren't counted as veterans. To be counted as a veteran, you have to have an honorable discharge. So if the Army boots you out to silence you, and you later die by suicide, you won't be counted as that number. And those numbers are actually really large. So it's actually hard to get a good sense, from a statistical standpoint anyway, of the actual scope of this. We just don't have any good data collection measures. So I think that Dr. Hagopian and Evan have been really wise to present it in this way, because I think that this is really the only way that the stories can get told. One, like, nobody likes listening to endless statistics. It's boring as hell. I don't like those lectures. I doubt any of you do either. But two, the statistics just don't accurately reflect what happened. So I really hope that by being here, the three of us can kind of better reflect what really happens in war, what really happens to all sides of it. I know you have had, I'm really grateful that some Iraqi people have been able to come here before me and share that side, because I definitely don't ever want, as a veteran, to speak over their experiences. So yeah, you mentioned that I was at one of the bases that housed one of the largest open air burn pits. As a result, I have a whole bunch of unexplained functional health problems. So I have irritable bowel syndrome, which we don't know why. We just know that my colon won't cooperate. And these things are linked to those burn pits exposures through mechanisms we don't quite understand. I have some pulmonary problems that seem to be cropping up as a result of burning garbage. Something that in the United States we learned a long time ago is bad, but somehow going somewhere else makes the military forget basic medicine. I have post-traumatic stress disorder. I have a traumatic brain injury that went undiagnosed for a year and a half. The symptoms of that were misattributed to the post-traumatic stress. And there is a lot of overlap, and there's actually some interesting research now about the ways in which having post-traumatic stress when you are brain injured can actually exacerbate your traumatic brain injury outcomes. Those psychological symptoms are an indicator that you probably won't have the best recovery from a brain injury. Yeah, I also have moral injury, which is this sort of vague, nebulous term that we try to use to define Perpetrator trauma is another good term for it, I think. I think that captures it well, at least in my experience. But this notion of being traumatized in a unique moral way, so perhaps there wasn't a stressor that threatened someone's life, but it did threaten their moral standard. It did threaten to make them perceive themselves as someone who is incapable of being good. And the guilt and shame from that can be pretty crippling. I think in the long run, the guilt and the shame more than anything are probably what I struggle with. I don't know if that's true for y'all, but that's certainly been true for me. And so yeah, I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to be here and answer any questions that you have as honestly as I can. It's part of my healing, and I think it's part of our healing as a nation from this notion that like war is an ideal way to resolve conflict. We have to have these conversations and tell these stories and share them with others so that we can make better choices, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. So we're going to start with some questions. I'm going to open up with just a couple of questions, and then we'll turn it over to the class. I have a quick question for Aaron, and then one for everyone. Aaron, I wonder if you would tell the class a little bit about Coffee Strong as an organization. I think many people might not be aware of that unique and interesting group.
Sure. Yeah, so Coffee Strong was started by a group of veterans who were students at Evergreen, so they were using that high-speed GI Bill to go to school at Evergreen. And they got together and decided that they were going to open what's called a GI coffee shop. And the emphasis historically, these existed during Vietnam as well. The emphasis historically of GI coffee shops has nothing actually to really do with coffee. It has to do with bringing people together to have safe space to have discussions about war and militarism and the military, experience as veterans, experience as anti-war protesters, peace workers. And that's a tradition that dates back to the Vietnam War. In fact, up here, what was it, the shelter half? Yeah. In Tacoma, the shelter half during the Vietnam War was a GI coffee house. And so they wanted to revive the tradition of GI coffee houses. So they opened Coffee Strong right outside of, at the time, Fort Lewis, now it's Joint Base Lewis-McChord, to cater to veterans' needs, to provide safe places for veterans to meet and discuss their experiences, to provide GI counseling to people who were still in. So say a soldier says, you know, I feel like I'm a conscientious objector, but the military has made that a really difficult process to navigate. Coffee Strong provides people who are trained in navigating that process. When veterans receive crummy discharges that deprive them of benefits, one of the things I do at Coffee Strong is help them fight to get their discharge upgraded so that they can have their benefits restored. We help veterans apply for VA disability compensation. We do a lot of community organizing and social work. Amy found me to speak to you guys through Coffee Strong. One of the former directors, Alex, has moved out of the area, and when Amy asked him, he said, well, no, but I'm out of the area, but I've got this other guy, Aaron, who could do it. And we respond to speaking requests like that quite often. And organize other social events. We had a thank you for resisting event on Veterans Day, so we thanked people who refused to fight, who either went AWOL when facing deployment, or we sent cards to Chelsea Manning to thank her for speaking out against the war, things like that. And for me, it has been a really key part of my healing and talking to other people who've worked at other GI coffee houses. My buddy Malachi Muncie worked at Under the Hood, which is now closed, but it was outside of Fort Hood. And our experiences have been that it's been really crucial to our healing to do this kind of work, to do this kind of direct veteran-to-veteran outreach. And as a social worker, it's been great. My field placement has been actually at Coffee Strong for the last year, so that's been a wonderful experience in my own professional development as well.
And Coffee Strong is a play on...
Yeah, it's a play on Army Strong at the time was the recruiting slogan. It's not anymore. And we did serve coffee at a point. We no longer serve coffee because like the latte machines or the espresso machines, like you steam the milk and stuff, like you can't talk to a client over that. It was super a pain in the butt. So we dropped that part. We still have the name, although for the record, I'm all in for changing it to something that's a little less nebulous now, but it's not up to me.
So the other question I wanted to throw out to all of you is kind of a generational question, in whether you might comment on what some of the differences are between the war in Vietnam and the war in Iraq.
Besides the booze.
Besides the booze, you know, it was mentioned. The welcome home was mentioned, and I hope that we've learned something along the way, that there's been a different sort of welcome home, a different availability level of treatments that are effective. But another thing is also the draft and the lack of a draft. So things like the welcome home and the what's the difference in having a draft versus only a very small part of the population who goes to serve, and most of the rest of the population is not involved.
Well, I would argue there's still a draft. It's just a poverty draft, not a selective service draft. Most of the people who go in the military go into the military because we just don't have a society that provides the resources people need to choose a different option. If you don't have the money to attend school, all those school benefits are pretty attractive. So I would say we still have a draft. It's a different kind of draft. It's probably, I would say, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a lot of disproportionality to the draft because it's not an across-the-board draft of 18-year-old males. Not that deferments weren't a very serious and abused thing. But I think disproportionately, the type of incentives to service we have now tend to skew military service towards working class and poor families. Disproportionately people of color increasingly. So it's a different kind of draft. I do think that it does impact the demographics of the service, though, because it's not as broad as what you experienced.
But in terms of the two different wars, everyone that I talked to, there's just a lot of similarities. In fact, most of us as Vietnam vets were very distressed when we found out that that it looked like we were going to be going into Iraq, because we knew that it was not okay, it was not good, and what the effects were going to be. I think one of the big things that's changed for the Iraq War vets has to do with all of the experiences that we went through as Vietnam vets, and how badly that was handled, and how the public responded, how our government looked down their nose at us, and how the VA horribly mistreated Vietnam vets. Most of us wouldn't go near that place for years. Like for me, it was like 40 years before I ever walked in one of those places. So that's different because of what we went through, and because we raised the level of consciousness of society that they need to support us. Even if the war is wrong, they still need to support who we are and what we did for society, if you will. And so the respect, the attitude, the approach, the support of veterans is far greater today than it was in our day. And personally, I'm very glad for that.
Yeah, I mean, like Sarah said, I think the similarities are, with, as Aaron said, much more similar than not, with the exception of being able to drink. Which is, you know, considering how available it was, it's a wonder I got out with an honorable discharge. But the perceptions of, that's an interesting point, is perceptions with, let's say, Iraq veterans and Afghanistan veterans, Vietnam veterans who returned, is there's some sort of, there's a lot of sort of misinformation about some things. One is that I was a member of the peace movement, the anti-war veteran movement, almost well within a couple of years after I got out of the Army. And the treatment that veterans got, for Vietnam veterans got from the American public, was not disrespect from the anti-war movement. It was from the older generation of veterans, the World War II veterans. I belong to an organization, probably one of the best service organizations, called Vietnam Veterans of America, which they have as their motto is, never again will one generation of veterans abandon another. And that was The VA was run by World War II and Korean War veterans, and they looked on Vietnam veterans as baby killers. We lost our war. You guys had long hair, you smoked dope, as if those really had anything to do with anything, as if World War II or Korean War veterans didn't kill children. They killed them by the thousands and tens of thousands. There's a good cartoon, it was a good cartoon, sorry I didn't bring it back. I think it might have been Oliphant, but it shows a long-haired Vietnam veteran with a field coat on, and there's a American Legion guy with his Legion hat, and they're standing in front of the VA, and the American Legionnaire is talking to the Vietnam veteran. He says, this front door is for real veterans, you guys use the side door.
Well,
so the VA in particular and American attitudes changed when Vietnam veterans came back and took over the VA. They shoved PTSD down the throat of the VA at the Department of Defense. Many of those people were Vietnam veterans against the war members, and they changed the dynamics of the Veterans Administration. It was not. It was forced upon the VA by Vietnam veterans. They now run the VA, for better or for worse. Let's see. We talked about, you know, personality disorders and moral injury. I ask you, most of you are raised by your parents and whatever religious affiliation you have and your friends and that sort of thing, is that killing people is not a right. You know, it's not a right thing to do. And what happens when you're in the military, whether you're actually pulling a trigger or supporting those people who directly or do pulling the triggers or patching up people who have been killed, is that what you see and do in the military is completely different. You have absolutely no conception of what it is to what you were taught to do. It's a 180-degree flop. And then part of the disconnection and distress that causes, and Aaron talked about it, we all talked about it, is the difference between what you're taught about and raised, and then you go and do something that is completely different. And then, unfortunately for the way it is, the dynamics of it is that the people who actually go to the war, veterans like us, we're the ones that actually carry the burden of that. The society as a whole just doesn't, they'd rather not talk about it. Actually, an Iraq veteran, I think you met him the other day, John Knox, this sort of dynamic that is now sort of a dismissive. It says, well, thank you for your service. John says, well, he says, what I usually reply is, says, well, how do you know I'm not a war criminal? Well, you know, as a veteran, I can appreciate sort of dark humor, but you know, it's a valid question, I suppose. When I first got out of service, and my mom, she knew that I was an interrogator, and I'd gotten out probably the worst war for the Americans anyway. 14,000 Americans killed the year I was there, and probably 10 times, at least 20 times that many Vietnamese. And she was a smart, educated woman. She said, "Are you a war criminal?" And at the time I said no, but I mean I was a part of the system, so you know I was up to my neck into what was basically a 20-year war crime in Vietnam.
Some of the women that I interviewed had a different reaction to the welcoming home and thank you for your service. And they said, how do you know that you're not welcoming home and thanking a rapist?
And that's actually pretty huge. Our civilian contractors, particularly, civilian contractors in the combat zone, KBR employees, Halliburton employees, could commit rapes with basically with impunity. The only potential punishment there was, because of loopholes in the law, were to send them back to the United States with no criminal record, no record that they had been found to have raped multiple women in a combat zone. There was one pretty egregious case that you can look up pretty easy. It's also in the movie Hot Coffee towards the end of that documentary. A woman who was employed by KBR who was raped, and when she attempted to get help for it, they locked her inside of a cargo shipping container, the metal shipping containers that you see on the back of like the railroad trains and over at the port. Locked her in one of those to keep her quiet while they destroyed all the evidence. This is like documented history. I wish I was making this up. So yeah, absolutely, you don't know who's a rapist or not. You have no way. I'm not, but you have no way of knowing that I didn't sexually assault people in the military. And that's not to say that the veterans that you know are rapists. In fact, 53% of sexual assault victims in the military are men, so they may very well be a survivor as well. And they could potentially be both, because people are complicated creatures. But you don't know what you're welcoming home, and it's interesting to hear the frustration surface about your experience with being angry about the lack of welcome home. And it's so interesting because I kind of have the opposite response. I don't want to welcome home. I don't want to be thanked for my service. It makes me very angry to be thanked for my service because it silences my story. By thanking me for my service, you're automatically making this assumption that what I did is something to be thankful for. And I don't feel that that's true, and I'm super duper uncomfortable with like this default assumption that all veterans are heroes and we should thank them all for their service. It silences our stories. Like, even all politics aside, it silences our stories to simplify them down to clearly what you did was honorable and thank you. Like, no matter who you are, it's just not that simple. And I think what veterans really, really need from any war is to be heard. These guys, these people, I wouldn't be here without them. Vietnam Veterans Against the War and Veterans for Peace really helped Iraq Veterans Against the War be born, the organization that I am part of. And without that organization, I just wouldn't be around. If I hadn't found IVAW when I came back and found other people like me who had the same experiences and the same feelings, I don't think I would have made it through that difficult period. One of the most profound moments was when I first saw an IVAW poster and it said, "You are not alone" on it. And that was pretty huge to realize, you know, it's "You are not alone, Iraq Veterans Against the War." And it's like, holy crap. Because you get this narrative of soldiers, and it's partially driven by like a desire to avoid cognitive dissonance. People will come out really strongly in support of the war, and there's a lot of pressure to not challenge that narrative. Be the flag-waving guy at the football game who, you know, looks good in a uniform. Don't challenge or question what we're doing or talk about, you know, the realities that aren't so pretty. And I think that the Vietnam era of veterans really kind of led that practice of speaking truth to power, of challenging narratives and challenging blind patriotism and encouraging people to look at the reality of our experiences. Having elders has been really, really important for me, and I know a lot of my fellow veterans. I don't know how your generation did it without really having elders to lead you through this, because we have definitely depended as a generation of veterans on the examples and the leadership of y'all. So thank you guys, and yeah, I would say that there are probably more similarities than differences. The differences are more political and based a lot more in the political climate of the time.
Okay, thank you.
One other thing that we haven't mentioned, I just want to throw out, is that one of the other health effects, at least from Vietnam, the Vietnam generation, was the fact that our government dumped toxic chemicals all over the land in Vietnam, all over the people that were there, without discrimination, so that it also fell on all of us. And when the soldiers came in wounded, that it was often all over their uniforms or bodies. All I had to do was open the door, and I could see it being sprayed, and I could breathe it in. And there are a lot of personal effects that I've had from that, including my children.
I know you want to move on, but I just want to say that I mean, that really does kind of sum up. You want to understand that the health effects of war. It's really, really simple. War is a political tactic that we use to suppress the other side. We use harmful means to do so. There's no way to hurt other people without hurting ourselves. You can't dehumanize others without dehumanizing yourself. So that the fact that, yeah, we dropped Agent Orange on Vietnam and on the Vietnamese people, and in the process poisoned our own people as well, that is pretty much the story of war. You cannot harm others without harming yourself.
And I just sort of like to make an addition to that, and that is the first Gulf War, so-called 1991. There are around 300,000, correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron, as far as I know, compensation claims from veterans of that war, largely for what they call Gulf War syndrome, which is toxic exposure to nerve gas and other sort of chemicals used actually in the war, burning oil wells, burning garbage and shit, you know, diesel fuel, you know, that's how they, you know, that's how you treat shit. You don't have a septic system, so you burn it with the number 2 diesel. And so these are something, a war that, you know, people don't think of it. There were not a lot of U.S. casualties, but nonetheless, the after effects of because of the toxic exposure to chemicals, also because of people who are giving unsupervised injections for chemical exposure and that sort of thing. They were all just given free willy-nilly. You could probably comment, but anyway, the number of claims for the first Gulf War, largely related to what's called Gulf War syndrome, is like you know, 300,000 people who have got claims, and the symptoms are various, and they don't really understand all the things, but they are definitely physiological symptoms that these people who are casualties of war. It's a huge number of people. So.
Okay, we're going to open it to questions from the class. Please speak loudly so we can capture your questions on the recording.
Thank you for your time as well. In terms of training before entering the war, because we watched a video earlier in the quarter and we were watching soldiers train, how would you say it differed from both wars?
Well, I think tactically there are a lot of different tactics. I mean, we didn't spend any time, we spent virtually no time learning how to utilize like cover and concealment, like hiding. Because it's just pointless. It's largely vehicular-based warfare and urban warfare, and neither of those are particularly stealthy. So there was not an emphasis on stealth. There was a significant emphasis on speed and basically using astounding levels of force. Shock and awe wasn't just the name for like bombing the crap out of a city full of civilians. It was also the name, you know, it's a very apt description of the tactical strategies that we used. Move in fast and use a lot of violence because you don't have cover and concealment and those sorts of things. So there's a definite emphasis on that. And I think there was, I don't know how prevalent it was in your training, there was a very overt emphasis on dehumanizing the enemy in training. And I don't know how explicit that was with your generation, if it was as transparent that you were trying to dehumanize people.
Yeah, we called them gooks.
Gooks, dinks, slopes, a few other names, but yeah, that's what we were called. And as far as training that I had, I went through 3 months of training as an analyst, as a military intelligence analyst, which was fairly comprehensive. You're basically sort of a super file clerk, and you look at documents and maps, that sort of thing. But they said, okay, well, when you're through with that, we're going to make you an interrogator. I got a 3-week interrogators course that changed my MOS. MOS is your military job, military occupational specialty. So your primary MOS is interrogator. You're an interrogator. Hell, I mean, the training that we got for these guys, these old deep displaced sergeants from Eastern Europe, these guys are all alcoholic, crazy Hungarians and Germans. Their idea was slamming a book on the table and talking to them, getting a prisoner's war, but that's not the reality of interrogation. Interrogation was, you know, you've got somebody sitting across you who's wounded, maybe he's got malaria, and they don't know, they usually don't know a goddamn thing anyway. And I spoke Vietnamese. I talked to them, and they, you know, most of the discussions were quite fruitless, and as I mentioned, the South Vietnamese Army routinely tortured people. We all knew that was happening, and some of the Americans did too. So the difference between what I was trained as a so-called an interrogator and what I saw in Vietnam was there was no relationship to it at all, you know. And Aaron talked about, you know, vehicular war. to a large degree, that was true of Vietnam too. But you know, if you're driving in traffic, you drove as fast as you could. If you ran over some people, that was just too bad. But you drove fast because you didn't want a grenade tossed in or somebody to pull up on a motorcycle and shoot you. And that happened all the time. Not only us running over people, but also getting a grenade tossed in the Jeep. There wasn't anything you could do about that in heavy traffic. You just jump out of the Jeep or the truck. So it made this sort of crazy mentality, and I drove like that. I'm sorry to say, run people off the road, and it's usually a function of how big a vehicle. If you had a deuce and a half, a 2.5 ton truck, you usually were king of the road, at least as far as the Vietnamese were concerned, because you could run just about everything off the road, except if another GI was driving a 5-ton tractor. So it was the sign in our motor pool for the 519th M Battalion says, "You're now entering one of the most dangerous parts of the world, Saigon traffic." So.
Yeah, I still resist the impulse to change lanes every time I go under an overpass because we were dodging grenades being dropped down through our gunner's hatches on our Humvees. And also never ever veering off the road no matter what happened to be in front of you, because you were probably being forced off to drive over the top of an IED. So if something was on the road in front of you, you just hit it.
And one other thing before I forget, you talk about being uncomfortable with doors. I still routinely, if I'm out in a restaurant, I like to sit against the wall, preferably in the corner. And as far as talking about the war, even with my family, who they know who I am, but I mean, I've put a wet blanket on more than one family gathering. And I talk about war crimes or my involvement, that sort of thing, and it's you know, even people that know you, they don't want to listen to this shit. So it's a difficult subject.
Aaron, you mentioned how you don't like being thanked for your service because you think it silences your story. This is a question for all of you though. How would you like to be received? What questions would you like to be asked? What kind of response would you?
When I meet other vets, I always welcome them home. I tell them I'm glad they're back, because I am. Both because I'm glad they made it back and because the more soldiers here rather than there, like, the better for me. So I don't thank people for my service. For their service. I genuinely let them know that I am glad that they're home, and that if they ever want to talk about their experiences, I'm here to listen. And I leave it at that. I think you have to be genuine and come from whatever your relationship is with that veteran. If you don't know someone, it's probably best to just let them know that you're glad that they're home, and leave it at that. If you have more of a relationship, then I think it kind of depends on your relationship. But yeah, thanking people for their services is a very loaded thing for a lot of reasons. I'm sure that there are veterans who love hearing it. I'm just not one of them.
During our generation, no one, and I really mean that sincerely, no one wanted to hear anything about that war or what our experiences were. And so I think that it can be really sensitive to ask a veteran, especially if you don't know them, if they want to share anything about it, because you have to be really prepared. You have to be prepared emotionally to receive whatever it is that they might share with you, and most people are not.
I think that's a good answer, Aaron. I said welcome home is certainly preferable to thank you for your service, because of the difficulties with that, absolutely. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, talking to a veteran, especially a combat veteran or somebody who has witnessed, you don't necessarily have to be a military to know what war is like. It'll be an eye-opener if you can talk to somebody and get them to talk to you. It's, you know, I would also add that I've been very lucky in that I got involved with activism and anti-war movement, mostly because I had to. There wasn't any choice for me, and I was lucky enough to find Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which provided me the opportunity to come to venues like this and to talk about my experience, I was always well received. I was always respected for what I had to say. This idea that activists or anti-war people actually somehow dissed or undervalued what veterans has to say was not true at all. Not true at all. I've had nothing but respect from people, from all sides of the spectrum. Although I have to say that I've run into situations where, in a public venue like this, I'd had World War II or Korean veterans. I can't believe that you're a veteran. No veteran would talk like that, you know. And as a matter of fact, Norman Schwarzkopf, who is now dead, a recent resident of the area here, he led the 1991 Iraq invasion. When he was told that that Vietnam veterans during Dewey Canyon 3 had thrown their medals in protest over the wall of the Pentagon, I think it was. He says, I can't, and he was a Vietnam veteran, a decorated Vietnam veteran. He said, I just can't believe that a veteran would do something like that. So I mean, his perception of what a veteran should be as a career lifer soldier and what we were doing as mostly 1 or 2 tour veterans is, there's a complete disconnect about what a veteran, you'll find that when you talk to veterans. There's opinions across the political spectrum.
Hi, Sarah. So in contrast to Mike and Aaron, you were already a nurse and you're already a trained psychotherapist.
No, I was a nurse, but not a psychotherapist.
Oh, okay. So you were already a nurse. So when you were thinking about joining the military, were you sort of hesitant to join an organization that took life away, or was that is that why you joined? Because you were a nurse and you wanted to help give life?
Yeah, that's why I joined. So I'll tell you that when I was in nursing school, I was 19 years old in nursing school, and I said to my classmates, if there's ever another war and I'm single, I'll go.
Okay.
And then, it was years later, 1966, when I was in Los Angeles, California, working as a nurse and working in an intensive care unit with really heavy-duty trauma and, grave illness. I was hearing on the radio about this place called Vietnam that I'd never heard of, and they were fighting there, and I thought, and then it hit me, and I said, oh my gosh. I remember saying that. And I looked at my life and where I was, and I was single, and here was this war going on. Did I really mean that? And I decided that I did, and it really was my desire to, Mike and Aaron, I was connected to all these young guys, and I was hearing what was happening to them, and I wanted to go and help. So I didn't think of it in terms of the actual war part, more about the effects and the results of that war, which is really what I got a lot of.
In the back? Yeah.
So I went to see the movie American Sniper, misled by the trailer, I have to say. And in the movie there was a character who starts to kind of cast doubts on the morality of the Iraq War. And he ends up dying, and the main character kind of says, well, he died because he cast doubts, and you should never go into a war and cast doubts on the morality of it, and that's why he died. And kind of that attitude towards people who kind of have a more anti-war perspective, veterans who have an anti-war perspective. Have you felt that attitude from other veterans that kind of take away from what you've done or the service that you've given, or non-veterans?
I definitely have experienced not getting along with my fellow veterans, although it's generally not so much my views on the war. I think amongst veterans, there's sort of an established look. You were in it, you can feel however you want about it. Other political beliefs, absolutely. No, where I actually run into issues is with pro-war civilians. Pro-war civilians really don't like me. I'm a real thorn in their side, and they let it be known that anti-war veterans are a really serious problem for pro-war civilians because they can't shout us down. They can't scream at us and tell us that we're just not patriotic and don't love our country enough. And that tends to be how those dialogues go, and we really throw a wrench in that. So there's some hostility there. In general, however, I would say that I'm more or less well received when I speak, because I think people can tell that what I'm saying is the truth, and you can only get so angry about the truth. You might not like it, but it's hard to hate someone strictly for telling the truth. I can't speak to your experience.
That was that's been mine too, and also I know that I don't begin to speak to for all veterans, certainly not even Vietnam veterans, but that in fact you end up speaking for a lot of veterans because for a variety of reasons they don't have the opportunity to speak up. They don't feel like they can do it. It's not particularly an easy thing for somebody who goes to a war to look in the mirror and say, well, that's what I saw, that's what I did, and I'm not really very happy about that, and then publicly go and say that. So a lot of veterans don't want to talk about the war, and you end up being a spokesperson for them, whether you want to or not. That's just the facts of the life. Most veterans who are of any war, who are in a war, don't have very much good things to say about it, because the effects of what it has on people, civilians and the military, it doesn't make any difference if you thought it was a good war. You talk to a World War II veteran and say, well, that was a necessary war and a good thing, but his or her personal liabilities from that war are the same as mine or Aaron's or Sarah's, because the same sort of things. Doesn't make any of you thought it was a good war or bad. You come back, you're going to have the same liabilities from that experience, whether you thought it was good or not. So that's what war does. How good the war doesn't make it. Knowing that it was a good war or not doesn't really change your PTSD, really.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, at least for this room. We have another venue that we can move to if people want to continue the discussion afterwards. But I'll give a round of applause.